Maya Thompson had always believed in kindness. It was a principle her grandmother had passed down to her, a quiet strength that reminded her to meet the world with grace, even when it wasn't always kind in return. So when she moved into a new neighborhood on the outskirts of town, she did what she always did, she tried to build bridges. It wasn't long before Maya noticed the way her neighbor, Mr. Reynolds, acted toward her. He was an older white man, set in his ways, and it was clear from the first day that he wasn't exactly thrilled to have a black woman living next door. He never waved back when she greeted him, never returned a simple smile, and more than once, she caught him watching her with a look that made her stomach twist. Still, Maya refused to let his coldness get to her. One morning, as she set a tray of freshly baked cookies on her kitchen counter, an idea struck her. What if she extended a small olive branch? Maybe, just maybe, a simple act of kindness could chip away at the wall he had built between them. After all, what harm could there be in offering a neighbor some homemade cookies? With that thought, she carefully arranged the treats in a box, tied it with a bright red ribbon, and stepped outside. The air was crisp as she walked up his driveway. Her heart pounded a little, but she steadied herself. Knocking gently on the door, she took a deep breath and waited. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and Mr. Reynolds stood there, his expression unreadable. His eyes flickered down to the box in her hands before returning to her face. "I just wanted to bring these over," Maya said with a warm smile, holding out the cookies. "A little welcome from me to you." For a long moment, he didn't move. Then, without a word, he took the box from her hands. He didn't thank her. He didn't even look at her again before shutting the door. Maya stood there for a second, exhaling a small sigh. Well, she had tried. Maybe he just needed time. Shrugging it off, she turned and walked back to her house, deciding not to dwell on it too much. 15 minutes later, just as she was settling down with a cup of tea, loud knocks rattled her front door. Her brows furrowed. That was unexpected. Setting her mug down, she got up and peered through the window. Her breath caught in her throat. 2 police officers stood on her porch, their faces unreadable. Confused, she opened the door. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice calm but cautious. "Ma'am," one of the officers said, his tone clipped. "We got a call from a resident in the area. Do you mind stepping outside for a moment?" Maya's heart skipped a beat. A call? From who? And for what? As she stepped onto her porch, the cold air biting at her skin, a sinking feeling settled in her chest. She glanced toward Mr. Reynolds' house and noticed his curtains shift, just enough for her to see that he was watching. Her stomach tightened. What had she done wrong? And then, the officer's next words made her blood run cold. Maya's breath felt shallow as she stood in the cold, her fingers curling into her palms. The officer in front of her had a firm stance, his expression unreadable. The other officer, standing slightly behind him, held a notepad, ready to write something down. "Ma'am," the first officer repeated, his voice steady but firm. "We received a report about suspicious activity at this address. A resident said you delivered an unknown package to their home and left in a hurry." Maya blinked, confused. "Unknown package," she repeated, her mind racing. Then it clicked. The cookies. She let out a small, breathy laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Oh, no. That was just a box of homemade cookies. I gave them to my neighbor, Mr. Reynolds." She gestured toward his house, where the curtain had just barely moved again. He was watching. The second officer scribbled something down before looking up. "So, you're saying this was just a friendly gesture?" Maya nodded. "Yes, that's all it was. I just moved in a couple of weeks ago and wanted to do something nice." The first officer's face remained neutral, but Maya could feel the tension hanging in the air. "And you didn't leave anything else? No notes, no other items?" "No," she said, shaking her head. Just cookies. The officer glanced back at his partner, who exchanged a look before turning back to Maya. All right. Would you be okay with us asking your neighbor about this? Just to confirm. Maya hesitated, her stomach twisting. She wasn't afraid of them talking to Mr. Reynolds, she had nothing to hide, but something about this whole situation felt deeply unsettling. What kind of person called the police over cookies? She swallowed the lump in her throat and forced a nod. Of course. Do whatever you need to do. The officers gave small, curt nods before stepping away. Maya remained on her porch, watching them cross the yard toward Mr. Reynolds' house. She could still see the slightest movement behind his curtains. She felt her pulse in her ears, her mind trying to make sense of it all. Had he really thought she was trying to harm him? Or was this something else entirely? She stood there, hugging herself against the evening chill, listening to the muffled voices of the officers as they knocked on his door. A few moments later, the door cracked open, and there he was, Mr. Reynolds. His expression was unreadable, his lips pressed into a thin line. The conversation was too far away for Maya to hear, but she could see the way he pointed toward her house, his face set in a hardened expression. One of the officers jotted something down while the other continued speaking to him. Then, slowly, they turned back toward Maya's house. She didn't move as they approached, though she felt a tightness in her chest. Well? She asked, her voice careful. The first officer sighed, adjusting his belt. Your neighbor claims he felt threatened by the package because he didn't ask for it. He says he wasn't sure of your intentions. Maya stared at them in disbelief. Threatened? He also said he doesn't want any further contact with you, the second officer added. Maya let out a short breath, frustration bubbling under her skin. I don't understand. I was just trying to be kind. The officers exchanged another glance before the first one spoke again. Look, we're not saying you did anything wrong, ma'am. But if your neighbor feels uncomfortable, we have to acknowledge that. Our advice? Just keep your distance. No more packages, no more visits. Just avoid contact. Maya clenched her jaw. There was so much she wanted to say, so many emotions swirling inside her, anger, confusion, even a little sadness. But she knew better than to push back too hard. After a moment, she nodded. Understood. The officers gave her a final nod before heading back to their patrol car. Maya watched them drive away, their headlights casting long shadows across the quiet street. She stood on her porch for a long moment, staring at Mr. Reynolds' house. The curtain had finally stopped moving. With a slow exhale, she turned and stepped inside, locking the door behind her. She leaned against it for a moment, her heart still pounding. It wasn't just the fact that he had called the police, it was what it represented. He hadn't even given her the benefit of the doubt. He hadn't opened the box, hadn't smelled the fresh cookies, hadn't considered for a second that she was just trying to be a good neighbor. To him, she was a threat. Maya clenched her fists, trying to shake the feeling away. She walked into her kitchen, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the quiet space. Her cup of tea sat on the table, now cold. For a moment, she debated letting it go, just moving on, as the officers had suggested. But something deep in her gut told her this wasn't over. And she was right. Because the next morning, something was waiting on her doorstep. A small, crumpled note. 4 words, written in shaky handwriting. Stay where you belong. Maya stared at the paper, her pulse hammering in her ears. It wasn't signed. But she didn't need a signature to know exactly who had left it. Maya's hands tightened around the small note, her breath catching in her throat. The words were simple, but their weight settled deep in her chest. She swallowed, her eyes scanning the empty street, but there was no one in sight. The morning air was still, the only sound coming from the distant hum of a passing car. She stepped back inside, locking the door behind her. Her fingers traced over the paper again, as if touching the ink would somehow make sense of it. "Stay where you belong." The words looped in her mind, sharp and deliberate. It wasn't just a warning, it was a message. A reminder. Maya had lived in enough places to recognize this kind of hostility. She had seen it in side-eyed glances at grocery stores, in the way people clutched their bags a little tighter when she walked by. But this was different. This was direct. This was meant to keep her in line. Her stomach turned as she stared at the note one last time before folding it carefully and setting it on the counter. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. Maybe she was overreacting. Maybe this was just an old man's way of making it clear that he didn't want her around. But something in her gut told her it was more than that. The day stretched on, but Maya couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. Every time she passed by the window, she caught herself glancing at Mr. Reynolds' house, half expecting him to be standing there, watching. But his curtains remained drawn, his front porch empty. By the time evening rolled around, Maya had decided to push the whole thing out of her mind. She refused to let one bitter neighbor dictate how she felt in her own home. She had moved here for a fresh start, for peace. She wouldn't let someone like him take that away from her. Just as she settled onto her couch with a book, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. A text from her friend Simone lit up the screen. "Hey, how's the new place? Loving the neighborhood yet?" Maya hesitated before typing back. "It's interesting. Definitely not boring." A few seconds later, Simone responded. Oh. What happened?" "Spill." Maya sighed, debating whether to say anything. But she needed to talk to someone. Just a weird neighbor situation. Nothing serious. "I tried to be nice, but he called the cops on me." This time, the response came almost instantly. "What? Girl, what did you do?" "Baked cookies." "Stop playing." "I'm serious." "Gave him cookies. He called the police. And this morning, I found a note on my porch telling me to stay where I belong." 3 dots blinked on the screen as Simone typed, then stopped. Then started again. "I don't like that." Maya exhaled slowly. Neither did she. "Do you think I should do something?" "Yes. But also, be careful. Some people don't need a reason to hate. And you know how these things can go." Maya did know. And that was the worst part. She finished up her conversation with Simone, promising to keep her updated, then set her phone down. She turned off the lights in her living room, but as she did, her eyes drifted toward the window one last time. And that's when she saw it. A shadow moved near Mr. Reynolds' house. Her breath hitched. It was hard to tell in the dim light, but someone was standing at the edge of his yard, right near the fence line that separated their properties. Maya's heart pounded as she carefully stepped closer to the window. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there. Watching. She squinted, trying to make out the features. Was it Reynolds? No, this person was taller, leaner. And then, as if sensing her gaze, the figure turned and disappeared into the darkness. A chill ran down Maya's spine. This wasn't just about an old man who didn't like his new neighbor. Something else was going on. And she had a sinking feeling that whatever it was, she wasn't meant to be a part of it. That night, she slept with the doors locked, the note still sitting on the counter, a silent reminder that she wasn't welcome. The next morning, as she stepped outside to grab her mail, she noticed something else. A single, crushed cookie sat on her porch. It was from the same batch she had given Mr. Reynolds. And it had been stepped on. Maya stared at it for a long moment, a bitter taste settling in her mouth. This wasn't just rejection. This was a message. Maya's stomach twisted as she stared at the crushed cookie on her porch. The sight of it sent a wave of unease through her, more unsettling than the note from the night before. This wasn't just an old man who didn't want her around, this was someone making a point. She forced herself to take a steady breath before bending down and picking it up. The cookie crumbled further in her fingers, little pieces falling to the ground. It wasn't the cookie itself that bothered her, it was what it meant. Someone had gone out of their way to take what she had offered in kindness and turn it into a threat. Her eyes flickered toward Mr. Reynolds' house, but the curtains were still drawn, and everything looked quiet. Too quiet. Maya stepped back inside, double-checking the lock behind her. The air in her home suddenly felt heavier, the walls closing in just a little tighter. She tried to go about her day as usual, but the tension sat in her chest like a weight. Every time she heard the creak of the floor or the rustling of leaves outside, she felt her heart skip. By the time the sun began to set, her nerves were raw. She found herself checking the windows more often, her body tensing at every passing car. The fear she had tried to suppress all day was bubbling back to the surface, and she hated that it was working. Whoever wanted her to feel unwelcome was succeeding. Just as she was about to close the blinds for the night, movement caught her eye again. This time, she didn't hesitate. She flicked off the light and pressed herself to the side of the window, peeking out through the narrow opening. The same figure from the night before stood near the fence line. But this time, they weren't just watching. They were closer. Maya's breath caught in her throat as the figure shifted slightly, stepping toward her yard. Her pulse pounded. She could barely make out the details in the dim light, but she knew this wasn't Mr. Reynolds. This person was younger, thinner, and the way they moved, it was deliberate. She swallowed hard, debating whether to turn on the porch light, to make it known that she saw them. But something told her to stay hidden. She reached for her phone instead, fingers trembling as she typed a quick message to Simone. "Someone's outside my house." Again. A few seconds passed, then her phone buzzed. "Call the cops. Right now." Maya hesitated, her gaze locked on the shadow standing near her fence. The person hadn't moved any closer, but they hadn't left either. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they turned and walked away, disappearing down the sidewalk. Maya let out a shaky breath, her fingers still gripping her phone. Another message from Simone popped up. "Maya, please. I don't like this. This isn't just some grumpy old man." Maya knew she was right. This had gone beyond one bad neighbor. This was something else, something she didn't quite understand yet, but she could feel it closing in. She barely slept that night. Every sound made her jolt awake, her mind racing with possibilities. By the time morning arrived, she was exhausted but determined. She wasn't going to sit back and wait for whatever this was to get worse. She needed to find out what was really going on. And she knew exactly where to start. Mr. Reynolds. Maya didn't waste any time. The moment the sun was up, she was out her front door, crossing the short distance to Mr. Reynolds' house. She wasn't afraid anymore, she was done being the one on edge. If he had something to say, he was going to say it to her face. She knocked firmly, her heartbeat steady but strong. Seconds passed. No answer. She knocked again. This time, she heard slow, deliberate footsteps. The door creaked open just an inch, enough for Mr. Reynolds' pale, wrinkled face to appear. His eyes narrowed when he saw her. "What do you want?" His voice was rough, impatient. Maya held his gaze. "We need to talk." He huffed, shaking his head. "Ain't got nothing to say to you." "Well, I have something to say to you." She leaned in slightly, refusing to let him intimidate her. "I know about the note. I know about the cookie on my porch. And I know someone's been lurking around my house at night." His expression didn't change, but something in his posture stiffened. "I don't know what kind of problem you have with me, but I'm not going anywhere," Maya continued. "So if you or someone you know is trying to scare me off, it's not working." Reynolds' eyes flickered with something, surprise, maybe, but it was gone just as quickly as it appeared. "You think I got time to be sneaking around your house?" he muttered. I don't care what you do. Just leave me alone. Maya frowned. Something about his reaction didn't sit right with her. The hostility was there, but the guilt wasn't. If he had left the note or crushed the cookie, wouldn't he at least try to deny it? She took a step back, exhaling slowly. Fine, she said. But if anything else happens, I'm calling the cops. His jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he simply shut the door, the lock clicking behind him. Maya turned away, but the conversation left her feeling even more unsettled. She had expected him to be defensive, maybe even angry. But instead, he had seemed wary. Like he knew something she didn't. As she walked back to her house, she noticed something she hadn't before. The fence between their properties. At first glance, it was just an ordinary wooden fence, but now that she was really looking at it, she saw something else, something faint, scratched into the wood near the bottom. Curious, she crouched down, brushing her fingers over the rough surface. The marks were shallow but deliberate. Letters. Words. Help me. A chill ran down her spine. She looked up at Reynolds' house again, her stomach twisting. If he didn't leave the note, if he wasn't the one creeping around at night. Then who was? And more importantly, who was asking for help? A sharp sound cut through the quiet morning air. A door slamming. Maya's head snapped toward the house next to Reynolds. It was an old, slightly run-down place, one she hadn't paid much attention to before. But now, something about it sent a prickle of unease through her. The front door had just shut, but she hadn't seen anyone go in or out. She lingered for a moment before heading back inside her own home, but now, her mind was racing. The pieces weren't adding up. Someone was watching her. Someone had left that note. And someone, somewhere, needed help. Maya had a feeling she was getting closer to the truth. But she also had a feeling that whoever was behind this, they knew she was getting close, too. Maya couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at the edge of something bigger than she had realized. The scratched message on the fence, the figure lurking at night, the hostility from Mr. Reynolds, it was all connected. But how? And why did it feel like she was running out of time to figure it out? That night, she stayed alert, determined to catch whoever was sneaking around. She kept her lights off and positioned herself near the window, watching. The street was quiet, the houses still. Minutes passed, then an hour. Just when her eyes started to feel heavy, movement in the shadows caught her attention. There they were again. The same figure, standing near the fence. But this time, they weren't just standing still. They were crouched down, fingers running over the same spot where Maya had found the message. Her breath hitched. This was her chance. She grabbed her phone, heart pounding, and quietly slipped out her back door. The night air was cold, sending a shiver down her spine, but she didn't let it stop her. She moved carefully, stepping as lightly as possible until she was close enough to see them clearly. A young boy. Maybe 13 or 14. His clothes were oversized, his frame thin. His hands were trembling as he scratched at the wood with something small and sharp. Maya's voice came out steadier than she felt. Hey! The boy jolted, spinning around so fast he almost lost his balance. His eyes were wide with fear. Please, he whispered. I didn't mean to. Maya held up her hands in a gesture of peace. It's okay, she said gently. I just want to know what's going on. The boy hesitated, his chest rising and falling with quick, shallow breaths. He looked past her, toward Reynolds' house, then back at the rundown house next door. You don't understand, he said, voice shaking. I had to do it. I had to make him mad. Maya frowned. Make who mad? Before he could answer, the porch light from the rundown house flicked on. The boy's eyes went wide with panic. No, he whispered. Maya turned just in time to see the front door swing open. A tall man stepped out, his face partially hidden in the dim light. His posture was rigid, his presence unsettling. "What are you doing out here, boy?" the man called out, his voice cold and sharp. The boy shrank back, pressing himself against the fence. Maya instinctively stepped in front of him. "He's not doing anything wrong," she said firmly. The man's gaze shifted to her, and for a moment, the air felt thick with tension. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back inside, shutting the door behind him. Maya turned to the boy, who looked like he was on the verge of tears. "Who is he?" she asked. "My uncle," the boy muttered. "I live with him. But I don't want to be there." Maya's stomach twisted. She didn't need to ask why. She could see it in the boy's posture, in the fear in his eyes. She crouched down so she was at his level. "Is that why you wrote the message?" He nodded quickly. "I thought maybe Mr. Reynolds would help. He used to talk to my mom before she was gone. But he stopped answering the door. And then you moved in, and I thought," he swallowed hard. "I thought maybe you'd help." Maya exhaled slowly, everything clicking into place. Mr. Reynolds wasn't the one behind the threats. He had been avoiding the boy, maybe out of fear or guilt, but he wasn't the enemy. The real danger had been next door the whole time. She pulled out her phone. "We're going to get you out of there, okay?" The boy's eyes filled with something new, hope. And for the first time in days, Maya felt something, too. She felt certain that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Maya's fingers trembled slightly as she dialed, her heart pounding in her chest. She kept her voice steady when the operator answered, giving them the address and explaining the situation as clearly as she could. The boy, still pressed against the fence, watched her with a mix of fear and relief, like he couldn't believe someone was actually helping him. "It's going to be okay," Maya whispered after ending the call. "They're sending someone." The boy swallowed hard and nodded, but his body remained tense, his gaze darting back toward the house. The light was still on, but the door hadn't opened again. Minutes passed, stretching out in unbearable silence. Maya kept glancing toward the street, waiting for flashing lights, for some sign that help was coming. She knew she had done the right thing, but part of her was still afraid of what might happen if they didn't get here soon enough. Then, at last, the distant sound of sirens broke through the night. The boy let out a shaky breath, his shoulders slumping slightly as if a weight had been lifted. Maya reached for his hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. When the police arrived, she explained everything, careful to include every detail, the lurking figure, the note, the crushed cookie, and finally, the message on the fence. The officers listened intently, their expressions growing more serious with every word. Then they turned to the boy, speaking gently, asking him questions. He hesitated at first, but eventually, his words came spilling out in broken, hurried sentences. Maya stepped back, watching as one of the officers placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, nodding in understanding. Another officer moved toward the house next door, knocking firmly on the door. The tension was thick, the silence unbearable. Then, the door opened. Maya couldn't see the man's expression, but she could hear the low, defensive tone of his voice as he spoke to the officers. He denied everything, acting as if he had no idea what was going on. But Maya could tell the officers weren't convinced. They spoke firmly, their questions sharp. And then, just as she thought the man would try to talk his way out of it, the boy took a step forward. "That's not true," he said, his voice stronger than before. "You know exactly what you've done." Maya's breath caught in her throat. For the first time, the boy wasn't cowering. He was standing his ground. The officers exchanged glances, then one of them asked the boy if he felt unsafe, if he needed to be removed from the home. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Please." That one word changed everything. Within moments, things moved fast. The officers spoke in hushed tones into their radios. One of them guided the boy toward the squad car, away from the house, away from the fear that had kept him trapped for so long. The man at the doorway protested, but it was clear he had lost control of the situation. The officers weren't listening to him anymore. They were listening to the boy. Maya exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the past few days finally start to lift. She had stepped into something she hadn't expected, something dark and unsettling. But now, as she watched the boy being taken somewhere safe, she knew she had done what she was meant to do. She turned and saw Mr. Reynolds standing on his porch. He looked different, his usual scowl was gone, replaced by something else. Regret, maybe. Or shame. After a long moment, he nodded at her. Just once. A silent acknowledgement. Maya nodded back. She didn't need to hear an apology to know that something had shifted. In the days that followed, things settled. The house next door remained dark and silent. Mr. Reynolds still kept to himself, but Maya noticed that every now and then, he would glance her way when she walked outside. Not with resentment, but with something softer. And as for the boy, Maya found out later that he had been placed with a foster family, one that truly wanted to care for him. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a new beginning. And sometimes, that was enough. One evening, as Maya sat on her porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she thought back to how it all started. A simple batch of cookies. A small act of kindness that had set everything into motion. She had moved into this neighborhood hoping for peace, but instead, she had found something else. A reminder that standing up, even when it was difficult, even when it was frightening, mattered. As she sipped her tea, she made a quiet promise to herself. She would always choose kindness. Even when it wasn't easy. Even when the world told her not to. Because kindness, real kindness, wasn't about what you got in return. It was about knowing that sometimes, it could change everything.